They lied to you. Black ghettos were not formed out of laziness or a predisposition towards violence. I will destroy these lies today with facts. The development of black ghettos in the U.S. cannot be traced to a single event, but rather to a combination of policies, practices, and historical circumstances that systematically marginalize black people. Here are some key factors that contributed to the creation of black ghettos in America. Factor number 1, slavery and its legacy. Slavery, which existed in the United States for over 2 centuries, played a foundational role in shaping racial inequality. African people were forcibly brought to the U.S. and treated as property, which laid the groundwork for systemic racism. After slavery was abolished in 1865, former enslaved black people were left with few economic resources, little education, and no land. Factor number 2, the role of slave codes and post-slavery segregation. Slave codes were laws that defined the status of enslaved people and limited their rights. These laws criminalized resistance to slavery, banned literacy and education for enslaved people, and restricted movement. After the emancipation, these codes evolved into the Black Codes. From 1865 to 1866, after the Civil War, Southern states passed Black Codes and sought to control the newly freed African American population. These laws restricted black people's mobility, labor, and rights to own property. Black people were often forced into labor contracts under exploitative conditions that closely resembled slavery, and they were often denied equal legal protection. Here are some examples of the Black Codes. Labor contracts. Black people were required to sign annual labor contracts with white landowners and employers. If they left their employment before the contract expired, they could be arrested or fined. Vagrancy laws. These laws made it illegal for African Americans to be unemployed or homeless. If a black person was found without a job, they could be arrested and forced into labor through convict leasing. Apprenticeship laws. Black children could be apprenticed to white employers or families, often without the consent of their parents, leading to forced labor and a continuation of a system akin to what? Slavery. Restrictions on property ownership. Many black codes prohibited African Americans from owning or leasing land in certain areas, preventing them from becoming economically independent. Curfews. In some states, black people were required to be off the streets by a certain hour, effectively limiting their freedom of movement. Public accommodation laws. Black people were often segregated from whites in public spaces like schools, restaurants, and transportation. Factor number 3, the New Deal in the 1930s. During the New Deal era, the federal government implemented various programs to help people suffering from the Great Depression. However, these programs often discriminated against black people. For example, the Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934 to insure mortgages, refused to insure loans for black families or those buying homes in predominantly black neighborhoods. This worsened housing segregation as black Americans were denied the opportunity to buy homes in more affluent white neighborhoods, reinforcing the development of ghettos. The government's public housing initiatives, such as the Public Works Administration and the Housing Act of 1949, created subsidized housing for low-income families. However, these programs often segregated black people into distinct, overcrowded public housing projects. Factor number 4, Jim Crow laws. Following the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, the South implemented the Jim Crow laws that legalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement of black people, perpetuating the economic and social marginalization of black communities. These laws forced black people into segregated, overcrowded, and underfunded spaces. Everything was separate, but not equal. Our schools had fewer resources, restaurants, bathrooms, water fountains, movie theaters. They literally made sure that they got the best of everything, down to the size and cleanliness of water fountains, to make sure at every turn that we got the worst version of everything. And then lied to the world talking about how we were separate but equal. They lied then and they're lying now. Factor number 5, the Great Migration. From 1916 to 1970, in the early 20th century, millions of black Americans moved from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West. Places like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, seeking better job opportunities and escaping the violent racial oppression of the South. However, they were often confined to the poorest and most overcrowded parts of the city, where housing was cheap and conditions were deplorable. This led to the creation of predominantly black neighborhoods, often referred to as ghettos. Factor number 6, redlining. Through the 1930s to the 1960s and beyond, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, through its Homeowners Loan Corporation, drew maps to guide bank investments. These maps ranked neighborhoods based on their desirability for investment, and predominantly black neighborhoods were rated as hazardous or high risk, colored in red on the maps. This practice became known as redlining. As a result, black people were systematically denied access to mortgages, loans, and housing in better neighborhoods, which kept them confined to poorer areas. Factor number 7, white flight. After World War II, as federal policies like the GI Bill subsidized home ownership for white Americans, many white families moved to suburban areas, leaving urban areas increasingly populated by black and other minority communities. This process was known as white flight, accompanied by the disinvestment in cities and a further concentration of poverty in urban black neighborhoods. Also, there were restrictive covenants. Real estate developers and homeowner associations in the cities across the country used restrictive covenants, written agreements that prohibited the sale of property to black people. This practice was widespread in the early 20th century. Factor number 8, black Americans, even after the civil rights movement, faced systemic discrimination in employment, limiting their access to well-paying jobs and economic mobility. Employers would often hire black workers only for low-wage, low-skill jobs, perpetuating cycles of poverty. Prime example, in the 1970s and 80s, as industrial jobs left cities in post-Vietnam War period, many predominantly black neighborhoods faced severe economic decline. Factories closed, and the service economy did not create sufficient opportunities for working-class black families. This economic shift led to higher unemployment, a decline in property values, and an increase in poverty rates within black communities, exacerbating ghetto conditions. Factor number 9, welfare programs were stigmatized, and particularly in post-1960s era, often seen as creating a dependency culture. Even though white Americans received more welfare benefits overall, and still do to this day. Factor number 10, police brutality. In the 20th century, black communities often faced heightened surveillance and policing. Law enforcement practices targeted black neighborhoods with more aggressive policing, including practices like stop and frisk, police brutality, and harassment. This increased violence and instability within black ghettos, further entrenching their status as marginalized areas. Factor 11, the crack cocaine epidemic and the war on drugs in the 1980s. The U.S. saw a rise in availability of crack cocaine, particularly in black urban neighborhoods, because they were flooding our streets with the stuff. The epidemic was widely covered in the media, often in racially biased ways, portraying black communities as drug-infested and dangerous. In response, the federal government launched the War on Drugs, which disproportionately targeted black communities. Policing tactics such as stop and frisk, mandatory minimum sentencing laws led to mass incarceration of black people, particularly young black men. The criminalization of drug use and the subsequent increase in incarceration rates further destabilized black communities, disintegrating families, and increasing the poverty and violence that were already prevalent in our neighborhoods. By the 1990s, the U.S. had the highest incarceration rate in the world, with black people disproportionately representing the prison population. The policies surrounding 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimum sentences, especially for drug-related offenses, disproportionately affected black men and contributed to the further destabilization of black communities. The explosion in incarceration rates has been described as part of a prison industrial complex where private prisons and the prison labor system exploit incarcerated individuals. Factor number 12, political disempowerment, voter suppression. Although Black Americans gained the right to vote with the 15th Amendment in 1870, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, systemic voter suppression, literacy tests, poll taxes, gerrymandering, and voter ID laws continue to disenfranchise many Black people. This lack of political power further limits the ability of Black communities to advocate for change or access resources to improve their living conditions. In conclusion, these historic examples spanning from slavery and the Black codes to the war on drugs and mass incarceration demonstrate how systemic racism has shaped and maintained the ghettos that Black communities are often regulated to in the U.S. The racial segregation, housing discrimination, and criminalization of Black people created a vicious cycle that kept Black people isolated in poor urban neighborhoods, often marked by poverty, violence, and inadequate resources. These ghettos are not the result of any inherent failures of the communities themselves, but rather the product of centuries of intentional systemic oppression and discrimination. I love you, Black man. I love you, Black woman. Knowledge is power. Power to the people.